300 dead, 1,000 homes burned, and 1,000 businesses burned, in a massacre that spanned over 2 days and 18 hours. While watching two television shows on HBO, The Watchmen and Lovecraft Country, both shows depicted the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. This got me interested and started doing extensive research on the subject to find out more about it and why we hadn't heard about it in history. So today, history is extremely relevant. History permits us to see where we come from, recognize where we are, and guide us to where we need to be. Today, I'll be discussing how Greenwood was established and got to be known as Black Wall Street, what sparked the riots, and the aftermath that it left behind. So let's start with how Greenwood was established. According to History.com, a black landowner named O.W. Gurley purchased about 40 acres of land. He named his town Greenwood after a city in Mississippi and wanted this to be a safe haven for blacks to come and build their own community. Greenwood was extremely successful. As we see in this picture, we have three customers going to a gas station. They're extremely well dressed, have their own car, and every business around the homes are owned by African Americans who were freed slaves or descendants. Greenwood became so successful, they had their own bank, they had their own train system, and had their own school system. And economically were independent to the point where they became known as Black Wall Street. Now let's take a look at what sparked the race riots. An accusation of sexual assault, a black man accused, and mob invades Greenwood. Now, History.com reports that on May 30th, 1921, Dick Rowland was entering an elevator. He tripped and grabbed the arm of Sarah Page, who was a white female, and accidentally ripped her shirt. She screamed, he ran out. A co-worker heard the scream and saw him running and reported to the police that he tried to sexually assault Sarah Page. He was arrested that night, and the next day the Tulsa World paper reported that the assault happened, but he would also be lynched the next day. A mob of about 1,500 white Tulsans showed up at the prison and demanded that the sheriff hand him over so they could execute a public lynching. 75 black Tulsans showed up at the prison, a couple of them armed, to fight off the mob, and they wanted Dick Rowland to get a fair trial in court. A fight ensued and shots were fired, and a white Tulsan was shot and killed. Now, in the article, Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921 on Britannica.com, Melissa Pruccizello and Jeff Waldenfeld write that white Tulsans attacked Greenwood in retaliation of the confrontation at the prison. When they attacked Greenwood, they shot blacks on sight, they looted their homes and businesses, and they even dropped kerosene bombs from airplanes as they flew over Greenwood and crashed those planes into buildings. Now that we learned how the riot started, let's take a look at the aftermath that it left behind. Aftermath that left Greenwood destroyed. Melissa Sullivan, an award-winning journalist and editor, wrote for History.com that the governor of Oklahoma at the time approved the National Guard to go into Greenwood and put an end to the massacre. This next picture I'm showing you is the aftermath that was left after the riots. Greenwood was completely wiped out. Nothing stood still, just maybe frames of buildings here and there. But this is what it looked like. By the time the National Guard got there, it was too late. The massacre was over. No whites were arrested for the actions that ensued, but 6,000 blacks were arrested and detained. Because there was a lack of evidence, Dick Rowland was released from prison. Both him and Sarah Page left town and were never heard from again. But the story of the race massacre was almost erased from history. Now, Dave Cathy, editor for the Oklahoman, writes that media sources like the Tulsa World reported that 2 whites died in the riots, but left out the mass destruction caused by the mob. This last picture is actually a cutout or a printout from the actual Tulsa World that says 2 whites dead in race riot, but we don't see anything else about the massacre and the destruction that was left behind. A newspaper called the Black Dispatch, that was a black-owned newspaper at the time, did an opposing editorial listing all the details of what happened in the massacre and actually what was left behind, the destruction and the actual toll, the death toll that was left behind for blacks and whites. There was a brief inquiry into the riots, but the reports disappeared, according to Pruccizello and Waldenfeld. And this event is actually missing from the history books. Now, survivors of the descendants of the Tulsa riots are doing their best to bring awareness to this event to the entire world. Viola Fletcher, Hughes Van Ellis, and Leslie Bedingfield are three remaining survivors. In an article and recording by Joanna Summers on NPO.org, survivors of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre share eyewitness accounts. These survivors testified before Congress as eyewitnesses of what happened in Tulsa and Greenwood, are known as Black Wall Street. So in conclusion, we learned how Greenwood was established, why it became Black Wall Street, what sparked the riots, and the aftermath that it left behind, and that leaders tried to erase this event from history. As I said earlier, history permits us to see where we come from, recognize where we are, and guide us where we need to be. As Sir Winston Churchill once said, those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it.